how Annie Proulx's book came to you and how you first began working with executive producers Scott Rudin and Eli Bush in terms of getting this material off the ground.
Well, I was asked by Carolyn Bernstein, who's the head of drama at Nat Geo, to look at this book that Scott Rudin had brought her. And Annie Proulx was an author that I knew well. I'm a novelist and short story writer, so her book, The Shipping News, meant a lot to me. So Scott Rudin, Annie Proulx, Carolyn Bernstein at Nat Geo, who I've worked with on The Bridge before, I paid attention. And sure enough, as advertised, it was a 700-page book. I had not read the book before it was sent to me. And it's a big book, probably on its face unadaptable because it covers 300 and some years of history of that area. But I read it. I was immediately intoxicated with the world, and there's nothing like it on television. Whenever you're doing something like this, I'm always looking to do something that's not out there. And there was definitely not a show about New France on television. So it was easy with those auspices to say, yeah. And they took a chance on adapting a world and a show that isn't out there right now. It's really easy to greenlight cop shows and medical shows. A show about this portion of our history is a real narrow slice of American history. And I thought the perfect time to do it. So it was one of those things I jumped at.
Elwood, why is it, do you think, that Hollywood hasn't adapted this era, the 1600s, that often? Like the last time I remember Hollywood, going after this era real big was the early 90s with The Last of the Mohicans and Bruce Beresford's The Black Robe. Is it action oriented? Because muskets are kind of hard to load. But why is it that Hollywood hasn't gone after this era that often?
Well, I mean, I think it's a portion of history that it's not as sexy as like the settlement of the West or the founding in Jamestown. But it's if you look at it, so the oldest, Quebec is one of the oldest cities. It is the oldest city in North America. And when I read into the history past the novel, what I found was fascinating, just trying to apply it to our times today, is that struggle of multiple cultures coming together in one small area in a really harsh environment, heavy winters, very thick forest, bugs, many different First Nations tribes, all had competing reasons to either trade or not trade with the French and English. And then you had the Hudson's Bay Company working its way up from the Great Lakes. It's just this amazing, I don't know. The question is, I don't know why, but I felt like I'd uncovered a gold mine with all these competing factions. And the themes that are in the Barkskins, the show that we made, are still relevant today. Is how is an empire made? How is our country formed? And our country, and I know this takes place up in Canada, which has a little bit different attitude towards the First Nations tribes. It's the history of our country soaked in blood, and it's soaked in the sort of struggle over land and taking people who don't have very much and exploiting them and the land equally for gain. That's true today in our country. And I think, if you ask why, I think those are hard things to look at. Those are unpleasant things to look at. We have a tendency in our country, I'm speaking as an American, to look away from unpleasant truths. And again, I'm doing a television show. I don't mean to put your face in it, but I do think it's really important. And I'm not asking you to eat vegetables here. I'm not asking you to, I'm not lecturing at you. I think it's really important to examine our history, even in a fictional terms, because it opens people's minds. If I can't too many people tell me I didn't know anything about this part of our history, that's a big reason to do it for me. And then to make it exciting, the muskets kill people just as good as good old rifles do. It just we didn't have any barriers to the violence and the action in our show. We really went for it because it was an exciting time to live and a scary time to live.
Marcia, you read the book before it was turned into the series. Tell me about what your first impressions were after reading it.
I love her writing, and she spanned such a huge scope in this story. I had read Brokeback Mountain and Shipping News, so I loved her. She kind of has this, we've described it as kind of a muscular poetry. But in this, I was immediately taken with the story of the haves and the have-nots. It felt like it was the kernel, a very raw kernel of capitalism, and that you got to see how canny somebody had to be to survive in this environment. I didn't know a lot about the French and the English, war. I mean, we know, well, there's a French speaking area up in Canada. Gee, I wonder why. We certainly didn't learn that in school. But I was reading the book and I loved it. It had such a huge scope to it that when I heard that Elwood and Nat Geo and the gang was making this show, I sort of begged to be a part of it, except that my character wasn't in it yet. Annie focuses more on the men, the early loggers, the early Barkskins in the mid 1600s, 1690s, and the women are more descendants that come on further down the line. But Elwood was writing a character, and as we talked, he kind of shifted a little bit. He was writing someone, I think, a little bit younger who had the power to have babies, because women's one of the huge, powerful things that they could do was to have a baby. It was a wealth and a resource. And so when he cast me, he cast someone who wasn't having no babies, birthing no babies. But what became interesting was that these two female voices in the community are the older ones, are myself and the nun. In fact, they are the female voices of the community, and they're both older women who have a kind of a wisdom, and their value source isn't having babies. So they represent different things. And Mathilde turned to be this incredibly practical woman. Elwood said a while ago how France was trying to kind of bring the French lifestyle over to the middle of this wood, surrounded by this fortress and these hostile people. And they were trying to bring, you'll see in Mathilde's husband, he wanted to bring the linens on the table. And she, to me, became a voice of the new world, because she was like practical. They're unrefined people we're serving. This is an unrefined area. And so she was kind of eschewing some of that rococo-ness of France and bringing something very practical to this world. And she became ultimately the voice of a working woman, which was a source of power. She was advertising it as a source of power.
David, Monsieur Trapinet, what a guy. The last time I saw you was in Fargo as Mr. Varga. You had a lot of teeth problems in that, but here you're wearing this great fancy jacket. Tell us more about Monsieur Trapinet. He has the gusto of an explorer. Though he wants to build a doma, he wants to build a sky table. Tell us more about him and his aspirations.
Well, he's one of the few people who we see really does just want to settle there, which was, I think, unusual for the French. They were more into the mercantile trade, but his whole motivation is to settle, to in his position as a noble man, to marry a noble woman and have a family to inherit his legacy. And he's a poetic figure in the whole story. He's something of a dreamer. We wonder if he's delusional, which was what's so delicious about playing him, because he's a real anomaly. I don't think you can ever really quite get to the bottom of him, which makes him very entertaining for me to play, because he's such a contradiction, where I wasn't quite sure if I liked him or not, or whether the audience should like him or not. I wasn't sure if he was a kind man or a very cruel man, or a very charming man or an obnoxious man. All these things are kind of a gift to an actor, to really spend 8 episodes and still be exploring all the many facets to the character. He wasn't something that I got straight away, and even now at the end of the whole thing, don't get him completely. And it wasn't really there in the book. This was all Elwood's character, really. I think he's a very different character to the Trépanier of the book, and I just found him very, delicious to play, because he was so enormously complicated and rather silly, and we don't trust him. And I think he's a real gift to an actor.